If you want to know the truth, follow the money. It's true, all sorts of shadowy figures across the world, all sorts of illicit industries, all the hidden hands that seek to influence the world we live in or enrich themselves from it. Whether it's a public corruption scandal or a complex and costly fraud or an organized ring of criminals lurking in the underworld, everyone can lie or follow the money. And the money always leads to the truth. Across the continent of Africa, a hidden web of alliances, smuggling networks, and state and black market partnerships have long protected one of the world's most lucrative secrets, the illegal gold trade. Its scale has been well known for years. Revenues to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, money that some among the continent's rulers have used to wage brutal wars, slaughter the innocent, and enrich themselves while their people starve. But how that network functions, where that gold goes, and how it's converted into cold hard cash, seemingly without making a fuss, has been a mystery. Until now. So on today's special episode of Warographics, we're going to follow the money into a convoluted network that provides the origins, the funding, and oftentimes the motive for some of the most devastating conflicts of the 21st century. While we will, as always, draw on a wide range of reputable sources to conduct our research, today's episode simply wouldn't be possible without one source in particular. And that would be a report by the non-government organization SwissAid, released on the 13th of May 2024, and written after extensive research by two investigators, Yvonne Schulz and Mark Amol. But before we dig into the report and pull back the curtain on the network that Schulz and Amol discovered, we've got to answer two key questions. What actually is the illegal gold industry, and why does it matter? Illegal gold mining in Africa, or as it's better known, artisanal mining, wasn't always the massive illicit industry that it is today. In fact, the practice wasn't always one that happened illegally, and even today it can still be legal depending on the nation and the circumstances. The core idea behind the movement was rather simple. That small-scale gold producers, be they locally owned companies, community mines, or whatever else, could mine and sell off gold on their own instead of working for large-scale, typically state-run or international organizations. Typically, they use labor-intensive methods to mine their gold, the sort of operations that rely only on basic tools and technologies and use humans to do the rest. In some places, they've gained legal recognition, like in Burkina Faso, Kenya, and Ethiopia. Now, on paper, it's actually a fairly good idea. Working on, say, a community-focused artisanal mine is a good way to ensure decent labor conditions or to see that a community can access and leverage the wealth on its own land instead of living off wages paid by the person harvesting it. But in practice, a combination of weak and corrupt law enforcement, lax or disinterested governments, and the powerful financial incentives that come with controlling gold production has meant that artisanal mines that do start up with good intentions have a target on their back from day one. Faced with gangs, militias, and other organizations who want their mines and have the means to take them, it's exceptionally rare that small-scale miners have been able to fight back. And with the artisanal mining industry basically taken over, these organizations have had all the reason in the world to expand production, starting new mines and industrializing the ones they've got in order to extract as much profit as possible. How these groups interact with their respective national governments depends on where they are and what regime they're living under. In some African nations like Ghana or Tanzania, national governments are known to complain about and even condemn the miners exploiting their lands, even if they lack the means or the political will to address the issue. In places like that, local officials are often a convenient asset for artisanal miners to stay out of reach of the law, especially in parts of the world where a bribe paid from even a paltry fraction of the year's mining revenues is enough to make a person far richer than anybody else they know. In other places, like South Africa, miners place themselves directly at odds with local governments and take violent action when it suits them. South Africa's illegal miners, called Zama-Zamas, have been known to take over mines, defend their illegal operations there by attacking police and local security, and even attack journalists who have attempted to expose the practice. And in other places like the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, these sorts of operations are believed to operate in a way directly complicit with the national government. As for how the mining groups themselves function, the specifics will typically vary, but the fundamental industry structure is at least relatively predictable. The Minerals Council of South Africa summed it up as follows, attempting to explain how that particular country's Zama-Zamas do their business. The miners themselves working in the mines and the pits are at the bottom of the hierarchy, simple foot soldiers driven into doing the brutal work involved with extracting gold at a large scale. The bosses and the gangs that run the mines are the ones in control, quickly taking possession of the gold that the mines produce and starting it along the process involved with actually turning a profit. Gold then goes to third parties who buy it in bulk, either regionally or nationally, and those bulk buyers transfer it to front companies which provide the legal cover to engage in exports. Then someone comes along from abroad looking to buy, and the actual lucrative sale of gold takes place. Internationally, the specifics underlying that structure have been hazy for a long time, but in broad strokes, that's how it seems to go. In some cases, the process of laundering the gold for Western buyers has even involved large-scale forgery, taking the smuggled gold, which is already of high purity by the time it's pressed into bars, and labeling it with the seals of well-respected Swiss refineries in order to pass it off. Through these forgeries, smuggling organizations can circumvent global regulations meant to keep gold that funds wars, terrorism, environmental damage, or political upheaval off of the legitimate market. Said one gold executive, then CEO of Australia's Perth Mint, of the problem, quote, "It's a wonderful way of laundering conflict gold. The gold is genuine, but it's not ethically sourced. They look completely genuine. They assay correctly, and they weigh correctly as well. Because gold is completely fungible, you can bleed it into genuine production." Then there's the second half of the question. Even if this industry is illegal, why should any of that matter to a person halfway around the world? I mean, illegal things happen every day in every place, and the world moves on. This shouldn't be any different, right? Well, no, unfortunately not, because with the lawlessness and exceptionally high profit incentives of the artisanal gold industry comes a stunning range of abuses perpetrated in the mining process. For the people who work the mines, few are paid anything resembling a fair wage for their effort, and many work under heavy armed guard from gangsters who are just as happy to enact violence upon them as in defense of those mines. Many are children who are, in some cases, even sought out for their ability to work with small holes and crevices. Their working conditions are often dangerous and entirely unregulated, with potentially deadly problems like methane buildups and mine collapses often not being guarded against. It's not uncommon for labourers not to be paid at all, and with the host communities around the mines firmly in the pocket of the syndicates that control them, ordinary people in their path often face a small-scale version of dictatorial rule. Even in places where criminal syndicates are less overbearing and it's possible to make good living mining for gold, as millions do across Africa, the methods used to mine the gold have ruinous side effects, poisoning soil and water with potentially deadly chemicals. Those chemicals, by the way, aren't particularly obscure or complicated. Instead, these miners use the basics: mercury, cyanide, and others. Naturally, smuggling networks rob struggling countries of a critical revenue stream, while those leaders that choose to make deals with the miners and take their cut are strongly incentivized to use authoritarian and often despotic tactics to keep a tight hold on their population, and thus their source of both national and personal enrichment. The general scale and effects of the artisanal gold industry have been known about for some time. A Reuters investigation in 2019, for example, found that the United Arab Emirates, a prime importer of gold both then and now, seems to be importing vast sums of gold that the official export numbers of African nations just simply can't account for. In 2016, the UAE imported over $15 billion worth of gold, some 446 tons. But when Reuters asked official industry mining organizations across Africa where they sent their gold, they weren't sending it to the Emirates, meaning that somebody else, the illegal side of the industry, was likely the culprit. For that particular investigation, nearly $4 billion worth of gold, or about 67 tons, found their way to the Emirates through means that weren't accounted for, primarily from Mali, Tanzania, Ghana, Togo, Cameroon, and Benin, along with a handful of others. The DRC, Sudan, Uganda, Chad, Malawi, and other governments indicated having their own problems with artisanal mining around the same time, yet the specifics of the process remained hazy, and after this illicit gold reached the UAE, its trail went cold. But, well, not anymore. Alright, so it's at this moment in our story today that we will turn to that particular report that we referenced at the outset, a 140-page tour de force of illegal gold mining that comes by way of that NGO Swissaid. And the results of the report are absolutely mind-blowing. Per the report, the year 2022 saw $30 billion worth of gold smuggled out of Africa. That's the equivalent to over 435 metric tons, representing a doubling in the value of smuggled gold in just the prior 6 years. Of all the gold that the report assessed was produced in Africa, anywhere between 32 and 41% of it was entirely undeclared, with the highest national producers of gold including Ghana, Mali, and South Africa. In all, 9 African nations were estimated to produce over 20 tons of illicit gold per year. The report was rightfully careful to emphasize that not all of this gold is controlled by criminal syndicates or mined under duress. Quoting here, "In many national contexts, the majority of artisanal miners are simply seeking to earn a living, have no choice but to work informally, and have no criminal intent." Yet while that is certainly true, it's all but impossible to establish figures for just how prevalent that sort of artisanal mining is when compared to more exploitative methods. While still in Africa, much of the gold moves to transit countries where local refineries and dealers can add another layer of uncertainty about where a certain shipment of gold came from and the conditions under which it was mined. And as for where those hundreds of tons of smuggled gold ends up, the answer is almost always the same: the United Arab Emirates. Per the report, declared gold exports from Africa tend to be transited to the UAE as well, along with other nations like Switzerland and India, where refinery infrastructure exists to process and purify it for the global market. But when it comes to the undeclared stuff, almost all of it flows into the UAE, either going directly or, in a relatively large share of cases, being transited through a neighboring African country from where it was produced, or perhaps even multiple other nearby countries, before then being shipped out. Of the 435 metric tons of smuggled gold the report counted in 2022, all but 30 tons of it ended up in the Emirates, and the total amount smuggled across the prior 10 years was far higher, nearly 2,600 metric tons. That's roughly equivalent to $115 billion in value. Out of all the gold in the Emirates listed as imported in 2022, 68% of it came from nations designated conflict-affected and high-risk, including nations like Sudan and the DRC that have since descended into major conflicts. That gold is often smuggled in personal luggage to the UAE by plane or flown on private jets that depart from transit nations in the gold smuggling trade like Kenya and Uganda before reaching Emirati airports and primarily the Dubai International Airport. But generally speaking, the UAE seems quite happy to take in all of this gold from other nations regardless of the conditions under which it was collected or the ramifications that come with propping up the illicit gold industry in this way. Once it reaches the Emirates, gold is gold, it's plain and simple. And then we get to the real kicker of the Swiss Aid report, where the authors finally succeed in answering the question that's gone unaddressed through years of global scrutiny. And that question? Where does all this smuggled gold, conflict gold, whatever else you want to call it, end up after it transits through the Emirates? And the answer, it turns out, is predominantly Switzerland, the same nation that the Swiss Aid organization behind the report calls home. Switzerland is the world's leading hub of international gold trade, and it's home to no fewer than 5 major refineries, importing thousands of tons of the stuff per year and processing most of it. But Switzerland also happens to have a loophole, because although countries like, say, the United Arab Emirates produce zero gold of their own, the location of production is not the measure Switzerland uses to classify the origin point of its gold imports or decide what gold does or doesn't meet its standards for ethical importing. If gold is imported to Switzerland by way of a certain nation, then according to Switzerland's current way of doing things, that's where it came from, meaning that all this gold, once imported to Switzerland from the UAE, is washed of its point of origin and brought firmly into the world of legitimate gold trading. To an outside eye, this is the sort of process where it's not much of a surprise that it went unnoticed for so long. Switzerland imports plenty of its own gold direct from Africa, including 267 tons of the stuff in 2022, all of which moves through the legal side of the gold industry to get there. Yet look at the fringes of Switzerland's import data, and small gold producers like Eritrea, Niger, and Gabon drop off the map over the span of a few years. So do nations where gold had previously been sold off after transit, Benin and Togo. From 2012 to 2022, the number of African nations that Switzerland imported its gold from took a nosedive, at the same time that Swiss imports from the UAE have gone through the roof. Officially, Switzerland only takes a very small proportion of its gold imports from artisanal mines. And not only is the UAE an apparent pipeline for gold transit to the Swiss, but so is South Africa, from which Switzerland imports amounts of recycled gold that go way beyond what South Africa should have in its legitimate recycled gold market. But again, once it passes through Swiss customs, that's just recycled gold from South Africa, no questions are asked. In Switzerland, regulators are not required or expected to conduct due diligence around assessing the conditions in which gold was initially mined if it's been sent off to an intermediary, and an issue that even the Swiss federal audit officers pointed out in the past but that has since gone unresolved. And once the gold enters Switzerland, it's treated across the world with all the legitimacy and global trust that the country's gold industry has built a reputation for. Switzerland imported some $95 billion worth of gold in 2022, but exported even more than that, at just a hair over $100 billion. It's the world's largest gold exporter, and gold is the product it exports the most of, with China, India, Turkey, the US, and Germany making up the majority of its export customers. So far as those countries know, and so far as they have to care, the gold they're getting is reliable and reputable, sourced from the very best of the best. All the while, they form an endpoint in a long financial chain, one that connects the world's superbanks, its high-pricing jewelry makers, and the wealth and belongings of the rich and famous into the same conduit as militiamen gunning down children who are too exhausted to keep going back down into their local gold pits. A conduit of gold that runs from war-torn regions of Africa to the Emirates, then to Switzerland, and then to the rest of the world, is a laundering mechanism that accounts for tens of billions of dollars in the global gold market. It's the sort of trade value that eclipses the entire GDP of nations like Iceland, Lebanon, or Armenia, the sort that dwarfs the world's humanitarian aid figures sent to the countries most in need. It's the sort of money that, if actually put toward the people and communities from whom that gold is mined, could almost certainly make a profound impact on every conceivable metric of well-being. Yet even showing this network in full view still doesn't tell the whole story, because now that we can see how this sort of network functions, we can start talking about what it really does. On the local level in Africa, the pipeline from generating money from mining and selling gold and having money with which to pursue other aims is a fairly obvious one. But like in any other area of life, it's the motivations and their specific impacts that really count. In many areas, the gold trade is a mechanism to prop up and perpetuate the same groups that enable artisanal mining in the first place: the gangs, the criminal networks, the corrupt local governments that make it happen. In many cases, the flow of money then travels to local warlords and criminal kingpins, some of whom have adversarial relationships with their national governments and others who have cooperative ones. Gold trade money often finds its way into the hands of terror organizations, particularly those in the Sahel and the African Horn, that have the capacity to operate transnationally and can control and exploit local communities as they see fit. Other times, the money passes into the hands of dictatorships or military juntas, ones that have all the incentive in the world to rely on artisanal mining practices rather than form a legitimate stake in the above-board mining industry. With that gold produced via illicit means, using cheap labor and facilities that no one from around the world would have any interest in visiting, it can be kept safely out of the way of international observers and gathered with whatever harsh extractive methods will maximize efficiency. Some nations, leveraging the international legitimacy of their recognized governments, will reclassify their gold internally or create paper trails to cover from where it came from and where it's been. Others are a good bit less interested in hiding what they do and can funnel the money made from their mines straight into their personal coffers as they see fit. And unfortunately, this isn't just an academic matter. In the Sahel, for example, criminal organizations rely on the gold trade, partly because of its ability to keep them relatively anonymous as one half of the transactions they're involved in. Make payments by wire transfer, and it can be tracked. Even bills are serialized. But gold, especially in its raw, unrefined form, bears no traces of ever having been used in a transaction. That enables them to freely take part in the other forms of crime that the Sahel has recently become known for: human trafficking of migrants and international terrorism. Violent takeovers of artisanal mines are common, and fatality counts well above 100 for a single takeover incident are not unheard of. In the current war across Sudan, gold is among one of the most precious resources to both sides. The Sudanese military dictatorship and a rival paramilitary faction called the RSF. Control over mines has become a primary driver of the conflict, and the RSF in particular depends on gold to fund itself. Said one UN report, quoting here, "Complex financial networks established by RSD before and during the war enabled it to acquire weapons, pay salaries, fund media campaigns, lobby, and buy the support of other political and armed groups." Now, perhaps by this point in today's video, it should be unsurprising to report that the RSF's links to illegal gold smuggling have granted it an ally in the United Arab Emirates, where much of the organization's money is held and from where many of the organization's weapons and supplies are smuggled in. The UAE denies supplying either sides of the war. On the other side, the governing military junta has taken many steps to obscure its gold sector from views since its 2021 takeover of the nation. In 2020, Libyan sources revealed to the United Nations that large numbers of Sudanese militants had been recruited from gold mining sites, while today it's likely that those trends have only continued. Stories like this are common up and down Africa. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, artisanal mines go far beyond just gold, and they fuel the intense violence, the rampant corruption, and the lawlessness that is common across much of the nation. Across the country, and especially in the east, rebels and militias charge crippling taxes on miners in order to allow them to operate, while raiding the mines, stealing gold, and extorting the people as they see fit. In Burkina Faso, kidnappings and mine takeovers are common as Islamist militants fight with criminal organizations and the government for control over the precious resource. In Niger, not only is outright violence over the mines relatively common, but so are industrial accidents like deadly cave-ins and the release of chemicals that poison animals and communities at large scale. And in northwest Nigeria, battles have been waged over gold mines for some time, in a multi-sided conflict that even the relatively powerful Nigerian government has little means to address. And finally, we've got to talk about the Wagner Group and the way that Africa's conflict gold has fueled the Russian war in Ukraine since nearly as soon as it began. Per a late 2023 brief by the Consular Choice Center, named the Blood Gold Report, the Wagner Group has been responsible for laundering some $2.5 billion to Russia at a minimum. The Wagner Group has been deeply entrenched across Africa even before the war began, operating as a semi-clandestine, unofficial Russian occupation by mercenaries who are willing to go to extreme, exceptionally brutal lengths to extract resources. In Sudan, Wagner shell companies process harvested illicit gold and smuggle it out, laundering it through the same convenient UAE-centered trade network that works so well for other armed groups. Not only does Wagner help to ensure that gold is mined as quickly as possible, but it also serves as a valuable protection racket, stabilizing the regimes and the local groups that control gold mines and taking their cut in return. Wagner's troops are more than happy to help keep friendly leaders in power, and that's a mission that has continued basically uninterrupted since the death of Wagner's leaders in 2023 and the group's subsequent partial assimilation into the Russian military. And nor is this whole UAE to Switzerland pipeline the only one that exists around the world. In the same Swissaid report that we've been referencing today, India was implicated for receiving a likely 200 to 300 tons of smuggled gold by air, land, and sea each year, although the sources of the gold smuggled into India are believed to be more highly varied and less easily traced. Turkey is believed to be receiving increasing quantities of smuggled gold, partly because of new import limits on the stuff, which have led previously legitimate importers to try and get the gold in through other means. During the late 2010s, Lebanon consistently reported receiving more gold than world nations reported sending there. Finally, China has become a prime destination for gold smuggling chains that are completely unreported in the import-export data of any country, owing to the role of Chinese nationals in Africa who control gold production and transport back to their home nations via smuggling networks fully under their control. When it comes to understanding conflict, it's tempting to look no further than big planes, bigger ships, and soldiers laying down their lives for good or evil. But no war has ever been so simple as that. And the conflicts that define the 21st century, big and small, have a layer of complexity all of their own. We began today's episode by saying it, and we'll say it again here. Follow the money. In many of the world's most active conflict zones today, in places where atrocities and mass death are all too common, following the money means following the gold. And now more than ever, we can do just that. If wars halfway around the world feel as if they're too distant ever to matter, go to the nearest jewelry store, ask to look at a gold necklace, and hold it in your hand. That war halfway around the world? That may very well be there with you.